Are you looking at raising rabbits for meat? You're wondering where you should start? That's what we're going to get covered in today's video. Hey guys, welcome back to another Slightly Rednecked video. Again, my name is Chris, and if you're not familiar with this channel, I help you to produce your own meat, eggs, and vegetables from your backyard, your balcony, your deck, your garage, or even a spare room in your house if that's the way you want to do it. And like I said in the intro, today we're going to be talking about where to start when it comes to raising rabbits for meat. Now, I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you probably already researched it enough. You already know why you might want to raise rabbits for meat, so we're not going to talk about that too much. We're just going to talk about what do you need to do to get started with raising the rabbits. First things first, you need to have some kind of cage system set up. You need to determine whether you're going to raise them in a cage or in a colony. Now, a colony setting is more like a very large, you can see I raise mine in cages, but a colony setting would be more like a very large open area that you had fenced off, and you put all your rabbits in there and you just let them kind of roam free. Now, at first glance, that may look like, you know, something that you want to do whenever you start thinking about raising rabbits. It just seems like a simple process to just put them in a big colony setting, let them run loose, let them breed, and take care of their babies and do all those kinds of things. But there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to colony raising. I don't have personal experience with raising them in colonies. I haven't done that myself, but I've seen lots of other people that have tried it and gone back to raising them in cages. I've seen there are some people that have done it and done it well and done it successfully, so I'm not saying it can't be done, but here are the considerations when it comes to raising them in a colony setting. One concern is going to be parasites. Whenever your rabbits are in contact with the ground, they're going to have a much higher likelihood of contracting parasites, and that could be something as simple as fleas and ticks, or it could be something like coccidiosis and other types of parasites and diseases that can get into their body, and it can run through your entire colony before you even realize it because they're in contact with each other. The other issues you may run into is rabbits can be territorial, especially the does. The does can be very territorial, and you may end up with issues with rabbits wanting to fight with each other to establish their territory. That's not, I mean, if you have a big enough area and you're not overcrowding them, that's probably not an overly big concern. I think the major concern, though, is keeping your rabbits in and keeping predators out. Rabbits like to dig, so if you just put a fence up around the rabbits, they're going to dig underneath it. You're going to have to do something to prevent them from digging out, and you're going to have to do something to prevent predators, foxes, raccoons, coyotes, skunks. I mean, everything wants to eat a rabbit. Hawks even. You're going to have to do something to keep those predators out and from getting to your rabbits. Now, there's lots of ways you can do that because I don't raise in colonies. I'm just giving you some of the examples of why you may not want to raise in a colony if you're just starting out. It may be something you want to research a little bit more before you make that decision. In my opinion, the better way to do that is to raise them in cages like this. Now, these are meat rabbits, and at first glance, if you're new to meat rabbits, you may look at these cages and think, oh, that looks horrible. They're all wire cages. You'll hear people talk about how that's just cruel to the rabbit. These things are well adapted to living in these small cages. You can tell they look pretty calm. They're pretty content. They're not pacing back and forth like they're nervous or bored. I've got a young doe over here that's just a little rambunctious today, but she's got room to run around her cage a little bit. And sure, they don't have room to just run like crazy, but they don't necessarily need that. They're well adapted to cage life. They've been raised for generation after generation after generation in cage life. They're used to it. It's no problem at all. In fact, they tend to get a little bit nervous when I get them out of their cages, and they're ready to go back in whenever I put them back in. Now, I use all wire cages because cleanliness, I think that's an important thing when it comes to your rabbits. You will hear people have concerns about how wire cages affect their feet, and it can really cause problems, cause what they call sore hocks on their feet, and that's on their back feet. The backs of their back feet. Typically what you'll see with sore hocks is you'll see on their pads of their feet, they'll develop a place with no hair on it, open wounds on their feet. That's an incredibly painful situation for rabbits to be in. But I will tell you, that's not necessarily caused by wire cages. Wire cages can cause that problem in certain rabbits, but it's really more of a genetic issue than it is an environmental issue. And rabbits that are prone to getting sore hocks will get them whether they're on a wire floor or if they're on a solid floor. The benefits of a wire floor far outweigh the benefits of a solid floor, in my opinion. And that is these stay way, way cleaner. You don't have to worry about feces and urine building up inside the cage. It all just falls through the wire. And that's what I have this catch system underneath for. So if you're getting started with meat rabbits, you're going to want to look at some kind of cage system for them, some kind of system to be able to develop the waste. Now, if you've got them out, you know, these are right up against my house, so I have these tarps that catch the waste that I dump into a bucket. I don't know if that's on camera or not. It's basically a big tub, and then I take it from the tub out to wherever. Now, rabbit manure is a cold manure. It's not a hot manure, so it can go right on your plants, right in your garden. It does not need to be composted first. One of the big benefits to having rabbits, whether you're raising them for meat or just raising them, is the manure. It's a fantastic fertilizer. Let me back up though, I'm getting a little bit off track. So back to wire cages. Why wire cages are good is they are much, much cleaner. And a rabbit, especially if it's one that's not prone to getting sore hocks, which most of your meat rabbits are not going to. Sore hocks is more of a, like I said, it's more of a genetic issue. Some of your pet breeds will be definitely more susceptible to that. Those you're going to want to look at caging a little bit differently. But when it comes to meat rabbits, wire cages are probably your best bet. They're going to keep the rabbits much, much cleaner. And if you have those rabbits standing on, if you have a solid floor, and especially if you have a wooden floor, that's a bad idea, because the rabbits are going to urinate and defecate, and it's going to build up in their cage. They're going to be standing in it all day, and that's what leads to infection and illness and those kinds of things in your rabbits. A wire cage is much, much cleaner. Now, with that being said, even with a wire cage, you're going to want to get something in there for the rabbits to get off the wire and give themselves a break if they need to, if it is bothering them. I've got tile in my rabbits' cages. They very seldom use them, but they do occasionally. You will find them laying on them or sitting on them. These are just pieces of tile. Let me show you one. This is it. It's just a piece of ceramic tile, like $1.50 maybe at the hardware store. And that's it. These are great for summertime because they stay kind of cool compared to the outside temperature. And you know, something you may be a little bit worried about when it comes to raising rabbits, if you've never done it, is what do I do about them in the winter? Really what you should be more worried about is what do I do with them in the summer? Rabbits have great big fur coats. Wintertime's pretty easy on them if you can keep them out of the wind. We'll get into that a little bit more here in a minute. Summertime is hard on your rabbits because it gets so hot out, and with those big fur coats on, they really struggle in the heat of summer. In fact, it's not a guarantee, but it's not uncommon for bucks to go sterile when the temperature's above about 85 degrees Fahrenheit for a prolonged period of time. Now they'll regain that. That's not a permanent state, but because of the heat of summer, it makes it very difficult on your rabbits in the summertime. So let me put this back up and we'll talk about what that means. Okay, so we talked a little bit about why you might want wire cages over a solid floor cage. The other thing about wire cages, and I would suggest you don't use wood to build your cages. You'll notice I have a wood frame that I hang my cages from, and that's because, well, two reasons really. One is rabbits chew on everything. So if you have wood in there, if you make their hutch out of wood and they have access to the wood, they're going to chew on the wood. So if you are going to do that, make sure you don't use pressurized wood. Don't use pressure-treated wood or any kind of wood that's been treated with chemicals or painted or any of those kinds of things, because the rabbits will chew on that. They'll chew it up. So that's another good thing about this. The other problem with wood is that it just soaks up urine and every kind of filth, and it's just almost impossible to get it clean at that point. If rabbits are in direct contact with that, then again, you're giving them an opportunity to introduce infection, disease, and those kinds of things because of unsanitary conditions. Wire is just much, much easier to keep clean. It pretty much cleans itself. There's not really anything you have to do. Okay, now as far as wire, what kind of wire do you need? Hardware cloth is not an acceptable choice for wire for rabbit cages. You need to get something that's a little bit sturdier. And really what you're worried about on the flooring especially is to make sure that you have a fairly wide gauge. You don't want little bitty thin wire because that will lead to foot problems with your rabbits. You need something that's a little bit of a bigger gauge. And if you look at any kind of welded wire at any kind of hardware stores or any of those things, that's probably going to be your best bet, is to get it at a local hardware store rather than order it online, because it is very heavy and the shipping's usually going to outweigh any savings that you have on buying it online. But if you look at this stuff, it comes in a gauge. You'll see 16 gauge, 19 gauge, 20 gauge, The smaller the gauge, the bigger diameter the wire is. So you really don't want to go with anything below a 19 gauge at the bare minimum. I would try to stay with 16 gauge or even 14 gauge if you can get it, but 14 gauge is pretty expensive. 16 gauge works just fine. What we use for the floor is 1 inch by 1/2 inch floor welded wire. So that means it's 1 inch gap by 1/2 inch gap. And let me bring you in a little bit close, I'll show you that. Okay, so you can see inside this cage. This is, let me put my hand under it so maybe it will, there we go. Maybe it will show up a little bit better. So you can see that that's a 1 inch, well here, there we go. 1 inch, well 1 inch this way by 1/2 inch that way. That's it. That's what we use for the floor. That keeps them from getting foot problems and having issues. Okay, that 1 inch by 1/2 inch welded wire that I use for my flooring, it's pretty expensive stuff, so you don't necessarily need to use that for the entire cage, but that does need to be what you use for the floor. Those cage walls and the tops of the cage, I usually make those out of a 1 inch by 2 inch. Yeah, I think it's 1 inch by 2. Yes, it is 1 inch by 2 inch wire because it's a lot cheaper. And there's no reason. I mean, it's plenty sturdy. It holds them up. Works just fine. My cages are 36 inches by 30 inches by 24 inches tall. You want your cage to be tall enough that the rabbits can stand up on their hind legs inside the cage. And these are plenty tall enough to do that for them. You don't want them little bitty short cages, keeps them cramped down all the time. You want them to be able to stretch out, stand up. And when I say stand up on their hind legs. They don't do that a lot, but you do need to make sure that you have enough room for them to do that. 36 by 30 inches is plenty big enough. You could get away with a little bit smaller for your bucks, but your breeding does that are gonna have litters, you're gonna want them at least that big right there. And that's a pretty standard size rabbit cage. This cage works well for a doe. When she has her babies, up to 9-10 babies, up till they're almost six to 7 weeks old, somewhere right around in there. You can have all those rabbits in this one cage, and it works just fine. I've got videos on how to build the cages if you're looking for that information. But that's what you're going to want to look for. Now, one thing I will say about wire is, especially on your does cages, you don't need to worry about on your buck, but on your does, you need to have that 1/2 inch by 1 inch wire, the same wire we use for the floor, run up about 2 inches all the way around the base of the cage. And that is what we call baby saver wire. What that is for when the does have their babies, they're very small. They're not very big at all. And if she pulls one of them out of the nest box, or it's out on the floor and it's squirming around, it can fit through this 1 inch by 2 inch wire and fall out of the cage. So you want to put that in there to keep those in the cage, because if they fall out of the cage, they're pretty much done for you. They're not going to make it. It's almost a guarantee. So that's pretty much cages in general. I mean, that's kind of a quick overview of it, but I do have a video. I'll link it up here. It's on one side. I can't remember which side it is. I'll link it up there on how to build a wire rabbit cage for your rabbits. You can go watch that video if you need to. And it's a very old video. It's the first video I ever put on YouTube. So forgive me, the production quality may not be the best. It's a little bit long-winded, but I think you can get the gist of it. These are pretty easy to put together. If you are looking at, now, should you build your own cage or should you buy a pre-made cage? Honestly, it depends, really. If you're looking at just 1 or 2 cages, probably a pre-made cage is the way to go, because you can't buy just the amount of wire you need for one cage. You're going to buy multiple. Now, if you're going to be building multiple cages, you're probably better off building, well, if you're going to need multiple cages, more than like 2, you're probably better off building. You'll get away a little bit cheaper by buying the wire and building it yourself. It's not terribly hard to do, and you will save some money that way. But when you're talking about just 1 or even 2 cages maybe, you're probably better off buying a pre-made cage. But I would look for a good quality one. Don't just get a super cheap, make sure the wire is good, sturdy, strong, welded wire. You want it galvanized as well, because you don't want it to rust and fall apart on you. You will have to change the bottoms out occasionally, every couple of years. I usually probably get about 4 to 5 years of use out of a cage before they start having problems. They start rusting down here and starting to fall apart a little bit, and then I have to change the bottom out. But it's usually just the bottom. The sides and the tops are just fine. I don't have to worry about it. So that's kind of a quick rundown of what you need for cages. Okay, you're also going to need somewhere to put your cages, and that brings me back to your summer and your wintertime thing. Now, like I said, in the wintertime, even if you live in, I live in southwest Missouri. It's not considered an extremely cold climate. We do have fairly mild winters, but we get down below freezing. We get there regularly, and we stay there for prolonged periods of time. So it does get pretty cold here. Rabbits do fine in the cold. All you need to do is provide them some kind of way to get out of the wind, out of the weather itself, and they're fine. You don't need to provide them with any supplemental heat. You don't need to stuff their cages with hay. In fact, it's probably a good idea not to do that because that's going to collect your urine, your feces, and put a breeding ground for mites and other kinds of parasites in there. So you're best off just putting them in an area where in the wintertime you may have to add some additional wind blockage. What I use is these tarps. You can see I've got them, they're all pulled back behind. And I'm freaking the rabbits out doing this. I'm gonna have to quit doing that. I'm freaking the rabbits out. I'll do this at another time when they're a little bit calmer. They don't like that. That kind of scared them. But these tarps just pull out. They're full length. They reach all the way to the ground. What I usually do in the wintertime, our predominant wind comes from this direction right here. So I'll pull these tarps down, pin them up against that side of the hutch right there, so it provides a wind block this way, and then they'll be stretched out here and staked out here, so I can get behind the tarps to deal with the rabbits, but it keeps all the wind and the weather off of them. In the summertime, I leave them completely open. Most of the year, I leave it completely open unless it's down super cold and there's a big wind chill. I don't even pull the tarps down because they need the ventilation, they need the airflow. They really much prefer being a little bit on the cool side than they do a little bit on the hot side. So really, again, summertime is where you're gonna have your biggest concerns. You need to think of a place where you're gonna put your rabbit hutch that it's not in direct sunlight. You don't want your rabbits sitting out there with the sun just beating down on them all day long. They won't last very long that way. They're gonna really struggle with that. So you need to, and not just, if you can avoid it, don't just give them shade of the hutch itself. In other words, you don't want the roof of the hutch to be their only shade. Now I have these on the north side of my house. I'm in North America, so the sun is on the south side. This hutch never sees direct sunlight. The shade from the house keeps it shaded all day long. In the evening time, for about an hour, the sun will hit from the side, but other than that, it's never in direct sunlight. There's never any, it's always in shadow and always in the shade of the house. And that does a pretty good job of keeping them comfortable. But, again, you do not want to put them out in your yard where the sun's just going to beat down them all day long and basically cook your rabbits. Put them under a tree. Put them provide them with some kind of shade. Get them out of the direct sunlight. They won't last very long in direct sun. All right, so I think we got cages, and as far as a hutch goes, there's lots of different ways you can build the hutch. Mine is pretty tall. It's a more of a shed, pretty simple structure. I've just got tarps for the walls to keep the sun off of them, provide them with a windbreak, but they get plenty of ventilation in here. You could put them in a small shed. You could build a smaller hutch. You don't need to have the roof as tall as what I have mine. I have it high like this because I can store my nest boxes and things on top of the cages. So I don't have to worry about the roof being in the way. That's why I do it, but you can do it a lot of different ways. How many cages do you need? Let's talk about that real quick. You're gonna need one cage for every rabbit. Every rabbit needs its own cage. You do not want to try to house rabbits together because, like I said, they can get territorial, they can start to fight. You're best keeping them separated in their own cages, controlling the breeding so you know when it's taking place and not letting it just occur whenever they want to, because if you put them together, there's going to be breeding behavior that takes place, or there's going to be fighting, one of the two. So you need one cage for every single rabbit. You might want one extra cage. It depends on how many rabbits you're going to breed. To start out, I would suggest just starting with maybe 1 buck and 2 does. That's probably an easy way to get started. 1 buck can easily service 2 does. You're not going to have any problems with that. It takes about 30 days for the rabbit from the time they're bred to when they start having their babies. So you want to have 1 cage for each rabbit and then maybe 1 extra cage for a grow out pen. So when your rabbits I leave them with their mother, and you're going to leave them with their mother until they get to be about at least 6 weeks old. You don't want to try to wean them off before that. And if you get good pedigree, breeding stock, good, I shouldn't say pedigree, purebred breeding stock, that are good meat rabbits. So those would be like a New Zealand white or a California or silver fox is what I have right now. But if they're good purebred meat rabbits, you should have your babies to butcher weight, which is about 5 pounds, by about 8 to 10 weeks, somewhere right around in there. And you can leave them in the cage with their mother all the way up till about 10 weeks. But at 10 weeks old, if they're not quite there, you're going to want to be able to separate out your bucks from your does and move them into separate cages and give them a little bit longer to grow out before you go and process them. So you may need an extra cage or 2, depending on how many rabbits you're going to be raising, you know, all those kinds of things. 1 or 2 extra cages is always good to have, just in case you need it. All right, so that's basically cages and hutches. You'll need a feeder and a water. You could do water a lot of different ways. This is an automatic watering system that has a nipple at the bottom that they bite on, and it lets water out. That works well in the summertime, but in the wintertime it freezes up, so you have to switch over. You can use something as simple as just crocks or water bowls. I really like these rubber. Let me get one out here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. I really like these rubber water bowls. This one's got water in it, so I can't tip it up, but you'll see what I'm talking about, hopefully. I like these because in the wintertime when they freeze, I can throw them on the ground, stomp on them, and knock the ice out of them. I can't do that with the ceramic ones. But you could, you know, if you had extra ones, you can just take one inside, put it under some warm water to thaw, put another one in the hutch, and fill it with water. So you can water them however you want to. You want to make sure that they have access to water all the time. 24 hours a day, they need to have access to fresh water. In the wintertime, it's not as big of a concern that... Here, let me put this up and then I'll talk. In the wintertime, I mean, it's not as big of a concern if the water freezes. When you go out and water the rabbits in the morning, just fill the bowl up about halfway or a quarter of the way because it's going to freeze before they drink it all anyway. They'll get a big drink out of it, come out, put a little bit more water in it in the afternoon. They'll go and drink as much as they want right then. They're going to be fine. But for the most part, you want to make sure that they have access to water all the time. Their feed, you don't want to overfeed your rabbits. I have these J-style feeders. You just cut a hole in the side of the cage, clamp them in there. They're pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy. But you only want to really give them about, most rabbits, it's going to be about a cup a day of feed. So, and I've got videos on all kinds of stuff about raising rabbits, but you're going to plan on about a cup a day of feed for your rabbits, unless it's a doe that has a litter. Once she has a litter, you keep her feeder full all the time, give her free feed. But you do not want to free feed all your rabbits because they will overeat, they will get heavy, and they'll get overweight, and an overweight rabbit it's going to have health problems. It's not going to want to breed. You're going to have all kinds of issues if your rabbits are overweight. So you want to keep them at a good weight. About a cup a day of food's going to do that for them. One other thing I will say about rabbits is that they have a fairly sensitive digestive system, so you don't want to get rabbits that have been on a purely pellet diet their entire life and then try to just switch them over all of a sudden to fresh greens and all that kind of stuff and just throw that in there, because it can give them diarrhea, and a rabbit with diarrhea does not last very long. If you are going to introduce fresh greens, look it up, like what's safe for rabbits, what's not, and introduce those slowly, just a little bit at a time. Don't just give them a whole bunch to eat all at one time and try to switch them from pellets to fresh greens. You're going to get your best growth rates. If you want fast growing rabbits to get to butcher weight quick, you're going to get that with pellets. Probably a 16 to 19% protein rabbit pellet. And if you feed nothing but that, rabbits are going to do fine. They're going to flourish on that diet, and they're going to get the best grow out rates. You can supplement their feed with hay and fresh greens, and you can even feed them completely with hay and fresh greens and fodder and that kind of stuff if you want to, but your babies are going to grow out slower. It's going to take longer to get them to butcher weight. You just make a choice, and you can kind of figure out from there how you want to go with it. I feed pellets. It's not that expensive. It's a lot simpler, and it just keeps things pretty easy to do, honestly. All right, so let's talk one more thing. If you're going to get into breeding your rabbits, you need to know kind of what to expect there, right? First things first, you never take a buck and put it in the cage of the doe. Does get very territorial. They can really do damage to a buck when he's introduced into their cage space. You always take the doe and you take it to the buck. Now, I've got videos on breeding rabbits. It's usually a pretty straightforward process. Sometimes you do run into issues though. Usually it's with the does. The does can be a little reluctant, especially first-time does that have never bred before. They can be a little reluctant to want to breed sometimes. And there are some things that you can do. I'll put a link up here to a video on what do you do if your doe does not want to breed. You can go watch that if you need to and learn some tricks on how to get them to breed if they're being reluctant. Most of the time, if your buck is not willing to breed, it's because he's overweight. Not always. He's either overweight or he's too old. Those are usually the two big things as to why a buck won't want to breed. Not always. Sometimes you get an oddball just doesn't have any confidence and is a little bit scared or whatever. But for the most part, bucks are usually pretty willing to breed. It's the does you're going to have issues with. What you want to look for a successful breeding is and it's very distinctive. You're going to know that it happens, so you're not going to have to second guess. I don't have to show you because, like I said, it's very obvious. You want to see the buck mount the doe, of course. She'll lift her tail up a little bit for him. He'll do his thing, and then he's going to seize up and fall over. And it's a very obvious thing. If that happens, you've had successful breeding. You can pretty much put it on the calendar. 30 days from now, we're going to have baby rabbits. So that means you need to prepare for what do you do when you have the baby rabbits. First things first, you need a nest box of some kind. These are the nest boxes I use. They are wire nest boxes made out of cage wire. Let me get them out of here, sorry. All right, this is what I use. This is a wire nest box. I like the wire nest boxes because, like I said, they're just like the cages. It stays a lot cleaner than having one that's solid. I've got some old straw and fur clumped in here I need to get cleaned out, but I can do that later. I don't know why I'm doing it right this minute. But I do like wire nest boxes. They stay a lot cooler. They also have a lot of ventilation, and that's important when you have the baby rabbits. What you're going to basically do with this, what I do is I line it with cardboard on the sides, the back, and the bottom, and leave it open on the top, and then I just stuff it full of straw. As much straw as I can get in there, and put it in there. Usually it's going to be 2-3 days before she has her babies, you're going to put in there. You do not want to put your nest box in too early. If you put it in, like, let's say I bred her and I put this nest box in today, she's going to start using it like a litter box. You don't want to do that. You want to wait till she's ready to have her babies pretty close to it before you put that in there, and there's a very easy way to tell when to do that. Somewhere around day 25 or so, day 25 days after you bred her, take a handful of straw and throw it in the cage, and if she picks it up and runs around the cage with it hanging out both sides of her mouth, it's going to be very obvious there too. You're going to know. You're not going to, if she's just nibbling on it and scooting it around and throwing it around, that's not what I'm talking about. She's going to pick it up, a bunch of straw, and it's going to hang out both sides of her mouth, and she's going to walk around the cage with it like that. That means she's looking for a place to nest. She's ready for a nest box. So line it with cardboard, stuff a bunch of straw in there, put it in there. I just put it back in the back of the cage. She'll move it around sometimes or whatever. And then you want to watch her pretty close for the next couple of days until she has the babies, because especially first-time moms will often have their babies right on the cage floor. And this is if they have them on the cage floor, they're usually not going to survive very long. They need to be in the nest box, snuggled down in the straw. She's going to pull fur and cover them up, and that's what's going to keep them warm and make them survive. And I have baby rabbits that, well below 0 when they're born, and they do just fine, no problems whatsoever. But if they're on the cage floor, you need to get in there quickly, pick them up, put them in the nest box. You don't have to worry about the mother abandoning them. She's not going to abandon them. It's not an issue at all. One thing I will say, you will see different styles of nest boxes. Some of them have a top on them. I don't personally like those because they, to me, there's not enough ventilation. It traps moisture inside, and moisture is not good for multiple reasons. So I like an open top nest box. That's my personal option. There are different kinds. You can use different ones. I don't like wooden either. I like to use these wire nest boxes, but that's just my personal choice, really. You could use, there's all kinds of different nest boxes out there. There's pre-made ones. I just make my own out of cage wire. So they're pretty simple to make. I've got a video on that too. I'll put a link up here if you need to know how to make a nest box. All right, one more thing about baby rabbits. You're probably not going to see the mother ever go and attend to her baby rabbits when they're in the nest box. That's perfectly normal. And they really don't do anything but feed them. And they only feed them once or twice a day. That's kind of a natural instinct so they don't draw attention to their nest and get predators pulled in and all that kind of stuff. So don't panic whenever she has her babies and she just doesn't seem to be paying attention to them. Now, some rabbits are a little bit different. Some of them get very protective whenever they have their babies, but most of the time they just kind of act like they're not even there. And you're probably never going to see her feed them. But as long as they live, as long as they're alive after a day or two, she's feeding them, they're fine. Don't stress out about that. All right, so we talked about taking the doe to the buck when it's time to breed, not taking the buck to the doe. We talked about all kinds of different things with cages getting set up. Get your feeders, your cages, all that kind of stuff set up before you ever get your rabbits. Now it's time to get your rabbits. So where do you look for your rabbits? What are you looking for when it comes to a rabbit? Well, don't stress out too much about this. There's lots of places you can find rabbits. You can look on Craigslist. You can look at FFA groups, like a local school or something like that. You can look at a Rabbit Breeders Association. Just Google that and find people in your area that are rabbit breeders and selling rabbits. As far as what kind of rabbits you want to look for, there are a few. I mean, there's lots of different meat rabbit breeds. The most common is probably going to be a New Zealand White or a California. Now, a New Zealand White is a fairly large rabbit, all white, pink eyes. That bothers somebody. That's a little weird to somebody, or some people. But they are a great meat rabbit, and they're probably the standard. I mean, that's the most common one, is a New Zealand White. California probably comes in second, and they're also all white, red eyes, but they have black ears and a black nose, and sometimes black on their feet as well. But they are slightly smaller than a New Zealand White, but they're still a great meat rabbit. And it's really, if you're not looking at selling the babies, all you're looking at is breeding for meat, it's not a bad idea to get a New Zealand White and a California, one a buck, one a doe, it doesn't really matter which one's which, and crossbreed. You do get that hybrid vigor that really makes for really strong, fast-growing babies, that first level of offspring. Now those mixed breed rabbits don't necessarily make good breeders, but if you're just using them for meat, it doesn't matter. That crossing those two genes together makes for some excellent meat rabbits. There are lots of other breeds of meat rabbits out there. I can't possibly cover them all. I do have silver foxes is what I have here. They may be hard to see right now because they're black for the most part. I've got one blue over here, the one I had out at the beginning of the video, but the rest of them are all black with the silver tip on their fur. I really like those too. In my personal experience, they seem to be a little bit mellower than the New Zealand Whites. New Zealand Whites tend to be a little, not necessarily aggressive. I mean, sometimes you will get an aggressive rabbit, but New Zealand Whites tend to be a little jumpy. When you pick them up, they just kick their feet like crazy, and they can really scratch you up really hard. I would never, if I had New Zealand Whites, you wouldn't see me holding one with short sleeves on. I would have, something protecting my arms, because they can really kick and scratch up your arms quite a bit. That's not aggression, that's just fear. It's just panic. It's fight or flight kind of behavior. So that is something to consider. I do find the silver foxes are a little bit easier to handle, but that's just my opinion. There's no reason not to go with the New Zealand White. They're going to be much easier to find, New Zealand Whites and Californians, and they're both pretty good breed. They're both excellent meat rabbit breeds. There's lots of other ones too. Now, lots of people, when they first get into raising meat rabbits, they think about the fur yield as well, because when you process the rabbits, you have the fur, the pelt. I will tell you that most of the time when we're processing rabbits, we're doing it fairly young, 8 to 12 weeks old, somewhere right around in there. And we do that because that's when their most efficient feed convergence is, from up to about 12 weeks, up to about 5 pounds. After that, you're feeding them a lot more for very little weight gain. So it becomes more expensive to keep them much longer than that. If you get good purebred stock of meat rabbits, a good purebred New Zealand, a good purebred California, a silver, whatever, you should get them to butcher weight by close to 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks. If it's taking you longer than 12 weeks to get them to butcher weight, then I would look for some different breeding stock, because that's expensive. It takes a lot more money to raise them that extra month, month and a half. You really want to shoot for about 8 to 10 weeks, somewhere right around in there if you can get them there. That's sometimes easier said than done. You really need pretty good genetics in your breeders to be able to get the baby rabbits up to 8 pounds. Or up to 5 pounds by that 8 to 10 week mark, but it can be done if you get good quality breeders. So, brings me back, when you're looking on Craigslist, when you're looking at rabbit breeders associations or 4-H groups or whatever, most of the time your 4-H groups, your rabbit breeders associations, they're gonna have good purebred stock. But when you're looking on Craigslist and you're finding just whoever in their backyard is raising rabbits and they want to sell a few of them, those rabbits, you don't really know for sure. They're not necessarily bad, but what I find in my experience around here is it's very hard to find purebred rabbits from a backyard, somebody breeding rabbits. They're usually crossing them. New Zealand Whites are usually crossed with Flemish Giant, and in my opinion, that's not a good meat rabbit. The babies grow out incredibly slow. Their bone to meat ratio is a little bit off. That means they've got more bone. So even though it's a 5-pound rabbit, you get less meat out of it than you would another rabbit that's 5 pounds, because their bones are bigger. So I would suggest do look at, if you can find it, if all you can find is somebody in their backyard and they tell you they got a purebred rabbit, then they may be right, and that's fine. But if you can look at a 4-H group, a rabbit breeders association, a state fair, you know, sometimes poultry swaps and things like that, you can find that stuff. What do you look for in your rabbits when you go to pick them up though? Just look at the individual rabbits and make sure that they look healthy. It's usually pretty easy to tell. The things that really stand out to them, look at their eyes, make sure they're bright, they're not crusty, they're not glossy, they're not like gunky. You'll know there's something wrong with their eyes. Look at their eyes, look at their behavior, make sure they're not just crazy spazzing out the whole time you're standing around, because that's a behavioral issue. You don't want one, if you reach your hand in the cage and that rabbit lunges at you, you don't want to bring that to that's an aggressive rabbit. You don't want to breed that into your rabbits. That can be passed on. So I would avoid that as well. Look at their feet, make sure there's no signs of sore hocks. It's going to be on their back feet. Like I said, it'll be pretty obvious. You'll see big patches of fur missing, bare skin, or open wounds. Don't bring that home to your rabbit hutch, or your rabbit's rabbitry, I should say, because that's going to be a problem you're always going to deal with, and it can be passed on to the next generation of rabbits as well. Just bad. You don't want to have that in there. Make sure that they look good and round. Like, let's get up here and look at a rabbit, what I'm talking about. You want a good meaty rabbit. You don't want a super lean rabbit. You don't want them to be long and lanky. You want them to be, you know, fairly robust, you know. And we'll look at a couple of different rabbits I've got here, because I've got younger rabbit and some older rabbits. Let's take a look at them real quick. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's open up his cage here. We'll get a better view of him. This is my buck. He is a silver fox buck, and you can tell he's a pretty round rabbit. I mean, he's got, you know, he's got good, I don't know if I can reach in here and pet him. He might freak out a little bit, and it's kind of hard to reach all the way back to the back of the cage. But he's got good shape to his body. He doesn't look lanky. If you feel his back, you're going to feel the meat, and you know, you can just tell he's filled out. Okay, so this is my younger doe. She's only, I don't know, 4 months old, something like that. So she's got a little bit of room to grow. You can still tell here. Let's turn her sideways. Come on, turn. Turn for me. Turn. There you go. There you go. Now you can see, even though she's stretched out, she's not all hunched up. She doesn't look lanky or thin or, you know, anything like that. She looks filled out really well, and that's kind of what you're looking for. Okay, so the other things you want to look for too is make sure, just, you know, check their genitals and their rear end. Make sure there's nothing, you know, looks crusty. It doesn't look urine stained too bad. It's not burned. There's not like feces stuck on the they don't show signs of diarrhea, anything like that. Those would be signs that you don't want that rabbit. It's not healthy. Honestly, you're probably not going to buy a sick rabbit, because when rabbits get sick and they have problems, they're fairly fragile. They tend to die pretty quickly. So, or they don't show symptoms until it's too late, and then they're dead. You know, that kind of thing. So it's probably not a big concern with that. Check their ears. One of the most common things you're going to end up with is ear mites. It happens to everybody. If you've got rabbits, you're going to get ear mites at one point or another. It's really easy to treat. Just a couple of drops of food grade oil, like olive oil, or I want to say stay away from avocado oil. I believe that can be toxic, but for the most part, any food grade oil, canola oil, olive oil, mineral oil, any of those things. A couple of drops in their ears once a day for about a week, and usually it's gone. But what you're going to see that in their ears, you want them to be fairly clean. You don't want them to be all scabbed up inside their ear canal, and that'll be deep in their ear. If you see scabs in there, that means they probably got ear mites. Again, you can treat that fairly easy. That's not a deal breaker. But if it's very bad, where it's on the outsides of their ears all the way up the tops of their ears, I would stay away from that rabbit. That shows that they haven't been treated. It's an over-infestation. It's going to be very difficult to get under control. You don't want to bring that home and spread it to all your other rabbits. So that would be another thing to check for. So when it comes to saving the pelts from your rabbits, really when you're processing them at 8 to 12 weeks old, you're not really getting a good pelt that's really useful for like clothing and things. It's really only craft purposes at that point, because it's not grown in, it's not thick enough at that point to be really a marketable, usable product, if that makes sense. So there's really not, you don't really have that dual purpose meat and pelt rabbit. If you want a good pelt that you can use for clothing or sales or, you know, whatever, you're gonna have to wait till they're about 6 months old or older before their pelt really grows in and becomes thick and full enough that it can be used for those kinds of things. So it's not really, I mean, you can still harvest the pelt, you can still save the pelt, and you can still make things out of it, but it's not the high quality pelts that you would normally expect to get when you're processing an animal for its pelt. All right, this is a pretty long video. I should probably look at getting it starting to wrap it up pretty quickly. I've covered, let's see, the cages, the cage material, nest boxes, breeding basics, the hutch, the feed. I think I've covered most of the kind of basic stuff that you want to know. The last thing I'll say is don't overthink it. It's not really that complex. Rabbits are pretty easy animals to raise, and that's why they make a great great meat animal if it's your first time raising animals for meat, or if you live like in a city environment or something. These guys are quiet. They don't take up very much room at all. You get excellent grow out from them, excellent feed to meat ratio. They actually convert feed to meat better than cattle. So pound for pound, you're gonna feed less to get as much or more meat than you would out of a cow, if that makes sense. And again, nobody's even going to know you have them unless you tell people that you do. So it's a great choice. It's super easy to do. I've got a ton of videos. If you need, you can go through my channel itself and look for all the rabbit videos. I tell you everything you need to know about raising them in one video or another. Hopefully this was helpful to you if you're looking at getting started in raising meat rabbits. And hopefully I didn't leave anything out. If I did, leave it in the comments below and let me know if there's something that you still have questions about. Or like I said, go search through my channel for a video that's already addressing it. But thank you so much for watching. I'm going to wrap it up here. And as always, God bless.